All right, Alexander, let's talk about what's going on in Ukraine. Let's uh, let's talk about maybe you want to talk about what's going on the ground. A lot of tried advances by by the Ukraine military in the Kherson direction, but I haven't seen any progress to note. I don't know if you've got something different. Bakhmut, I think, is pretty much the same advances by the Wagner group, but we don't have anything there to report either. And we have the dirty bomb update. I don't know if you want to do an update on the dirty bomb. That story. The Pentagon is doubling down and saying that they reject Russia's claims and they stand by Ukraine. IAEA inspectors are going to go now to Ukraine to find nothing. We know. I think we already know the outcome of that. And this letter from 30 Democrats, the squad, and all of these people telling Biden that perhaps it's time for peace, for some sort of negotiation with Russia, but most of the letter is actually a love letter to the neocons and to the Ukraine project and the conflict in Ukraine. That's what I got out of the letter. Anyway, and I know why they wrote that letter. I think it's crystal clear why they wrote that letter. They saw the protests against AOC in New York, and I think the Democrats said maybe we should go on the record to say that, hey, look, we tried to find some peace, so don't yell at us. And look, here's the letter we sent to Joe Biden. So we're all good. We're good progressives and Democrats. We're trying to find peace, but anyway,
Yeah,
I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I don't think
I
there's
think you
anything
summed it
else.
up. Yeah, I think you summed it up very well. Now let's just talk about the military situation. I mean, the only important piece of news, as far as I'm concerned, is that we've now had the chief of intelligence of the Ukrainian military coming out and saying the Russians are not withdrawing from Kherson region. They are reinforcing in Kherson region. There was a lot of rumors, debates, discussions whether the Russians might be intending to pull out from there. It was difficult to get very much concrete information. The indications were tended to support the view that the Russians were digging in. The Ukrainian chief of intelligence has now come out and said that that's what the Russians are doing. And I think that's far and away the most likely explanation. Now,
Well,
if
they're
you want to
creating a Kherson
understand,
militia as well, Alexander.
so they're building up a
right?
Kherson militia.
That's a huge
They're building
indication.
up,
Yeah.
exactly, they're building up fortified lines, and there's reports that they're sending in more heavily armed troops. I mean, the troops who were defending Kherson until recently were the Chechen militia and mainly paratroopers, who are sort of light infantry. They're now apparently being replaced by regular infantry with, armored vehicles and tanks and that kind of thing. Now, I think to understand what's going on the battlefronts, probably the best thing to do is to, reel back a little to that interview that the new overall Russian commander, General Surovikin, gave to Russian television, in which he said that what the Russians are going to do for the moment is they're going to fortify all their front lines, harden up the front lines, build up strategic reserves, and basically fight a war of attrition for the moment against the Ukrainians. And that is exactly the pattern. If you look all across the battlefronts, the Russians are not conducting major offensive operations. They're digging in, they're building fortifications in Lugansk region. We got lots of pictures of these, the sort of dragon teeth tank barriers being built and all that sort of thing, basically to prevent any more Ukrainian attacks. The Ukrainians are banging their heads against these fortified lines. They're not achieving anything at the moment. They're trying the same thing in Kherson region. I suspect the same pattern is shaping up there. And I get the real sense that the sense I'm getting is this is a holding operation by the Russians. They got their 300,000 troops. Actually, it's probably more than that. I've seen some suggestions it's going to be a lot more than that, because there's a lot of volunteers been joining the military as well. They're getting all those forces gradually trained up and ready, and sometime, we don't know when, they don't give us their timetable, then they will go on the offensive. But for the moment, the priority is to stabilise the front lines. And that was what Surovikin said he would do. And it seems to me that that's what he's done. So I think that is the military situation on the ground. And, there's missile attacks, they ebb and flow, but they continue as before. Zelensky is now complaining that he's lost more than a third of his energy system. Some of the railways, the electric traction on the railways is no longer working. But even there, I don't get the sense that this is the really big missile offensive. I think that's being held up as well. So I think that's the military situation. I think that the Russian plan at the moment is to stabilize it, build up their forces, go on the big attack when everything is ready, and that will probably be late November, perhaps early December, sometime around then. But, they don't share our plans. There are other things going on at the same time. There's the dirty bomb story. And I'm going to say this. As you absolutely rightly say, there was no way. I mean, in my opinion, there's no way the United States was going to come along and say, Ukraine is developing a dirty bomb, irrespective of whether Ukraine was developing a dirty bomb or not. And of course, they said no truth to this allegation. It's completely baseless. If it was that baseless, why send a team of inspectors from the IAEA? Obviously, those inspectors are going to give Ukraine a clean bill of health. There's a meeting of the IAEA in Washington, but Russia has been excluded from it. So, this is an organization that the US is essentially controlling at the moment. But nonetheless, I think the very fact that a team of inspectors has gone to Ukraine at all, I think it's intended as a warning to Ukraine. Look, if you are thinking of this, then don't. It's not something we want to see. It's a very, very bad idea. We don't want that kind of escalation. Drop that idea if you've got it. We will give you political, diplomatic cover. We will deny that this thing was ever, on your agenda. We'll say this is all more Russian disinformation. And at the same time, you know that this isn't something we want. And I think this is probably the end of the dirty bomb story. I think that Ukraine would not dare go ahead with it now after the US has publicly denied that they're going to, and has, as I said, given the kind of warnings that we've seen in the form of this IAEA mission. So I suspect that if the Russians wanted to kill this idea, if the Ukrainians ever had it, I suspect they've achieved it. That's my guess. We'll see how things go, but that's the way it looks to me. As for the 30 Democrats, I share your cynicism and your analysis 100%. I think these people have supported every step in the war up to now. I think they supported every escalation. As you said, their letter was a love letter to the neocons. I think it is interesting that they're calling for negotiations. And I think that probably reflects sentiment in the country, including rumblings on the left that they have to take into account. The letter in itself is totally insincere, but the fact that they've been obliged to publish it at all does give an indication of how the American people, even people on the left, feel about this war, which is skeptical and unenthusiastic, and becoming more so. I would also add that I think that there's a mounting sense of panic amongst the Democrats. I think that they realise they're trapped, that the economy is going badly wrong, that inflation is rising, that the president looks, shall we say, unengaged, and that it's increasingly looking as if the Republicans are going to win big in November. And I think that with all of that coming, I think some Democrats who are possibly worried about their seats, some of the House of Representative people who are worried about their seats might be anxious to sign up to letters like this because they want to tell their constituents in advance of the midterms, well, actually, I'm not really gung-ho for war. I want negotiations.
Right. The letter calls for some sort of diplomacy, a doubling down, I think is the word that they used, of a doubling of diplomacy between the Biden White House and the Kremlin. But there wasn't any diplomacy to begin with, so you go from zero diplomacy to what exactly? But the White House, they responded to this letter. They actually gave us an official response to this letter, and they told Karine Jean-Pierre, the spokeswoman, told reporters that they're not going to do anything that Zelensky doesn't want them to do. In other words, they just threw it back on Ukraine and Zelensky, and they said Ukraine is going to dictate negotiations and a solution, and we're going to listen to Ukraine. But they control Ukraine. They control Zelensky, so I mean, it's kind of this, merry-go-round thing. I mean, it's a farce. This is smoke and mirrors. It's a complete joke.
Smoke and mirrors. I mean, when Zelensky did negotiate, which is in March, they torpedoed it, and now they say, we're hiding behind him. I mean, he doesn't want to negotiate, so we're not going to push him. I'm just old enough to remember US officials saying the same about South Vietnam, that it was the South Vietnamese who would negotiate until, of course, it turned out otherwise. And in 1968, the United States opened negotiations directly with North Vietnam. So the US government, I'm sorry to say this, Democrat governments, this is a Democrat administration. They always say that, and then they do otherwise. The reality is that they control completely the government in Kiev. They decide whether it negotiates or not. They forbade it from negotiating in March, and they're now hiding behind the fact that it's not able to negotiate because they prevented it from doing so by persisting in their stance that they are not willing to negotiate either. If the United States government decides that its interests are better served through negotiations with the Kremlin, they will suddenly forget all these things about Zelensky being, having to green light those negotiations, and they will just go ahead and negotiate over the heads of the Ukrainians, just as they did with the South Vietnamese and just as they did with the Afghans. Now, what the White House response to this particular letter tells me is that at this moment in time, the United States, or at least the administration, is not interested in negotiations. The neocons, who are still very much in control, who are in fact completely in control, do not want negotiations with Russia. And I suspect that those particular people never will. And the only way to change that is to change the administration.
Okay, so the letter also reiterates the narrative, the talking point that Russia is losing.
Yeah,
it repeats that talking point, and it says that Russia is losing, Ukraine is winning, Putin is getting desperate. A madman like Putin getting desperate, and I'm paraphrasing here what they said, but we all know the talking point. A madman like Putin getting desperate puts us all at risk of some sort of nuclear conflict. That's pretty much what the letter says, and that's another reason why we need to engage with Russia to avert a nuclear catastrophe. And the logic that the collective West has pinned their entire Ukraine policy on is that Russia's losing, Putin's crazy, he's a dictator, he's going to launch nukes because that's the only way he's going to win this. That's their entire narrative.
absolutely, and the very fact that that narrative
What's
is
what?
repeated. Yeah, but I just wanted to say was the very fact that that narrative appears in the letter tells you that this isn't a sincere letter,
Yeah,
because
that's
if they
well.
stick with that
That was
narrative, then they have no real belief in negotiations either. As you exactly as you said at the start when we first discussed this.
well. My question is twofold. The first thing that I think about often with regards to this conflict is people like I think AOC signed this letter. Let's say the squad, and all these Democrats. I think to myself, they must be getting intel. You know, they're in Congress. I'm sure they're getting intel reports as to what's going on. Are these intel reports actually telling them that Ukraine is winning? Maybe, I don't know. Are the people that run these intel reports, do they not know what's really happening on the ground? Are they lying to the people in Congress? Are they not lying? And they're also misinformed because they're getting their information from the Ukraine Ministry of Defense. It's possible that they're just relying on the Ukraine Ministry of Defense to give them their information. I don't know. So there's one group, there's one argument to be made that if you go down the chain, all these people are misinformed, and they actually do believe that Putin is making his last stand. That's it. It's over. And he's going to push that button. There's the other argument, which just says they're flat out lying. They know what's going on, and they're lying, period. That's it.
Yeah.
Or you could also maybe make a third argument to say that they don't really know much of anything. They're just a bunch of dummies. It's just the blind leading the blind. Some people know, some people don't know. Maybe 15 of these 30 people kind of know what's going on, but they're like, whatever. Another 10 of them just has no idea where Ukraine even is on a map. Another 5 of them probably don't even know who Zelensky is. I mean, where do you think all this misinformation is coming from? What do you think is the real narrative that's dominating the Congress and the entire collective West leadership?
Yeah, I think it's really very simple, and I think this is where Russiagate was in some ways extremely useful, because what Russiagate showed, what in some ways Iraqgate with the WMD also showed, but Russiagate showed it even further, is the profoundly politicized nature of the intelligence services of the United States, the extent to which they have become neocon dominated and shape the information they provide to the political leadership of the United States, and not just the political leadership, but the media, everything, in order to reflect neocon objectives. So I think they are probably getting information from agents on the ground who are telling them, look, things are not going as well as you think. We don't see this great Ukrainian victory on the horizon that you're talking about. The situation in Ukraine is getting from bad to worse. We have rolling power cuts. The economy has all but collapsed. In unemployment, I saw one report that said that the true rate of unemployment is like 70%, not the 6 or 7% that people are pretending, because there isn't any economy functioning anymore. The military situation is nowhere near as good as you think or claim, because people are dying, people are wounded. I'm sure that there are people passing on that information up to Langley and the other US defense and intelligence agencies. The trouble is, as happened in Afghanistan, as happened in Iraq, but as is happening probably much more in Ukraine, along the way all that gets scrambled, all the bad news gets filtered out. What then is passed up to the political leaders is something completely different. And they continue to get the reports, which you can read them in Institute for the Study of War and all those places, very careful cherry-picked information which is intended to convey the picture that all is well and going well. So I think that's what's happening, and I think that there's some element of ideological bias, there's some element of outright lying and deception, but basically and overall, I think there's a sense also at sort of middle levels that you don't get promoted, you don't even keep your job as an analyst or as an intelligence officer if you tell it straight as it is. So you shape your analysis, you pick your information to give the impression that things are better than they are. And I think Congress is getting that kind of data, that kind of flawed data. And I think the White House is too. It's already happened, as I said, with Russiagate, where we saw a completely ludicrous and fantastical narrative spun for years as the truth. And of course, no part of it was true. And we found out how completely ludicrous it actually was. We saw that in Afghanistan, where, one more push was going to achieve what we were hoping for. And if we pulled out, well, the Afghan government would be able to continue the war for at least another year and probably longer and perhaps forever. And we saw that with Iraq as well. So I think anybody any longer who assumes you're getting the truth from the US intelligence community is basically deluding themselves, or perhaps wanting to delude themselves, wanting to believe this, these myths and that mythology, rather than wanting to get the truth. If you want to get the truth, well, there's plenty of sites, plenty of publications, ours being perhaps one of them, where you'll get a much more rounded picture of what's going on than you will if you read those intelligence briefings, which I'm sure the Congress people are getting.
Right. So we eventually got the truth about Iraq WMDs. We eventually got the truth about Russiagate. We got the truth about Afghanistan. What happens to the intel agencies? What happens to the political class in the United States and in Europe when we finally get the truth about this conflict in Ukraine? In other words, what happens when Russia does decide to go on this offensive in late November, early December, whenever it is, and Russia actually decides to fight this war? Because that's what we're talking about. Russia actually deciding to fight the war instead of this SMO thing that they did for 7 months.
Yes.
That's when they're going to burst this narrative Ukraine is winning, Zelensky's going to be marching on Moscow thing. What happens then to the political class?
Well, I think things will continue exactly as always. I don't think anything will change. I mean, did anything change after Iraq? Did anything change after Afghanistan? Has anything happened after Russiagate? I mean, one of the fundamental... Russiagate was the moment when there should have been a reckoning. I mean, more important than any of the others. I mean, Iraq, Afghanistan, they happened in other countries. Russiagate affected the political process of the United States itself. It affected the president. It looked at an election. It involved an issue of an election. It involved prosecutions of American citizens. And there has been no reckoning. None of the people who were involved in Russiagate have faced any real outcome, any real punishment for what they did. Igor Danchenko, Source A or whatever he was called, he was acquitted just a few days ago. So the result is, since there has been no reckoning over Russiagate, the most serious of all of these intelligence failures, what incentive is there for them to change? They will continue, or at least they believe that they should continue. As always, they will go on peddling these stories. Assad is about to fall. Moscow is about to be taken. Russia's economy is a house of cards. That was perhaps the biggest intelligence failure of all. Switch off SWIFT, sanction the central bank, and the gas station masquerading as a country will implode. It hasn't happened. Now, they didn't think that. That wasn't spun out of the air. There must have been intelligence backing all that up. But, that huge mistake landed us in an economic war, which is leading to recession in the West. And, I've just looked at some market surveys, and now it's established. Even the IMF is accepting that the Russian economy stabilized in 2022. And the latest market surveys in Russia point to expansion, even when we're seeing contraction in the West. But has anybody, any single person who talked up the story of Russia, the House of Cards economy, the gas station and all that, has anyone suffered any consequence with that? No. So if Kiev falls, if, Zelensky moves to Miami, why expect that anything will be different?
He'll have a movie deal
He'll have a movie
when he gets
deal,
to
exactly.
the U.S.
I mean,
And they've given us eight sanctions packages in Europe, not one, 8, and they're going on 9. So.
Yeah. So I mean, this is what's going to happen. I mean, I'm sorry to sound cynical, but I thought that with Russiagate, with Barr and Durham and all that, and this is where I was completely wrong. I said to myself, this is so serious. It's happened in the United States itself. It's affected the political process. They can't allow it to continue. Will they have?
Peter Strzok, I saw Peter Strzok the other day on CNN or MSNBC. I don't know the channel, but he's now a political commentator.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean,
yeah. Well, look at. I mean, the other one that always astonishes me is Max Boot, who appears all the time everywhere. I mean, he's all over the place.
McCabe.
McCabe, exactly. All of these people. I mean, have any of them been ever right about anything? And yet, they're still taken incredibly seriously. They're the experts, apparently. So, when Kiev falls, if it falls, you get an awful lot of spin as to how it happened, a little bit of soul searching, and then they'll move on to the next story. And that's what happens.
Yeah. And Zelensky will be starring in the feature film called Ghost of Kiev, The Battle for Snake Island in Hollywood. On some sound stage, green screen and all, doing that film. But just to close out the video very, very quickly, you said Assad must go.
Yeah.
You meant Putin must go, but
of course.
I think it was I think it was an interesting mix-up because remember the rhetoric back with Syria? Yeah. Assad must go. Assad must go. Exactly. I think Assad is still there, isn't he?
Yes, absolutely. You're quite right. Putin's
going to.
Exactly, he's a Freudian.
No, I was going to say Putin's going to probably stay as well.
Yeah. Absolutely, of course. The one single thing that guarantees that Putin will stay is that all the same people who talked about the Syrian leader going are now saying that he should. By the way, one of them who has a couple of brain cells, who is Neil Ferguson, the Scottish-British historian. I mean, he's written a very, very pessimistic article about the US in Bloomberg. I mean, I was astonished how pessimistic he was, because if you remember back in February, March, he was absolutely gung-ho for the thing. This was going to be the end of Russia, and, the Western, the West would ride on. And he's now talking about comparing the US, says, that people will one day visit its, the great monuments and buildings in Washington, and they will look at them in the same way as they look at the Capitol in Rome and the Palazzo Ducale in Venice. It'll be, monuments of an empire that has passed. Oh, it's quite an extraordinary article. So, there are some people who, were signed up to this project, who are beginning to see that things are not going to plan. But overall, generally, they will continue as they always have, because there's no retribution, there's no penalty if you get it wrong. On the contrary, all that happens is you get promoted. If you are right, if you say at the beginning, well, this is all a big mistake, we shouldn't do this, you're going to get punished, especially if events vindicate you. So that's the situation we have with the intelligence community, with the political system in Washington now.
Yeah, they have so much hatred for Russia.
Yeah.
So much hatred for Russia. But that very hatred is what's destroying themselves.
Yeah, it's
It
blinding.
destroys them. They can't let it go. They can't let that hatred go.
No, it
And
blinds
what
you.
it ends up doing is it ends up destroying everything around them.
American watchers should think about, perhaps one of the greatest novels of American literature, Moby Dick, and talk about an obsession, because that's what we see. And that didn't end well. It seems to me that we have the same obsession at work here.
All right, we will end it there. The Duran.locals.com. Look for us on Rockfin, Duran Shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.